The barn door creaked open behind her. She froze. Heavy footsteps crunched over straw. A breath reeking of liquor hit the back of her neck. "Thought I wouldn't find you, huh?" His voice slithered. But before he could take another step, a thunderous sound cracked through the air, a wild whinny, sharp and primal. The stall burst open. A massive chestnut horse stood between them, eyes locked, muscles taut. It was him. Scar on the cheek, white streak down the mane. The foal she'd raised in secret, hidden from everyone, even her mother. She whispered, "Riot?" The horse didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, unmoving, like a wall of fire between her and the man who haunted her youth. She couldn't breathe. But to truly understand how this moment came to be, we need to go back to the beginning. The week she stopped speaking, the world outside was louder than ever. Storms rattled the roof at night, thunder rolling like distant anger. Inside, the house was no quieter. Her stepfather slammed doors with the same force he slammed his words. Her mother floated between rooms, silent, as if she'd become a shadow of herself. And Nora, 10 years old, folded in on herself like a page someone gave up on reading. The silence wasn't a choice. It was survival. At school, they called it selective mutism. But Nora wasn't selecting anything. Her throat felt like a locked gate, and even when she wanted to scream, the sound just wouldn't come. So she drew instead, horses mostly, always in motion, always free. She covered pages with running legs, wild manes, and soft eyes. They didn't yell. They didn't leave. They stayed. That's when she saw him. It was near the woods behind the pasture, a place she wasn't supposed to go. The fence had a gap, and she squeezed through it one afternoon, barefoot and muddy, notebook clutched to her chest. The storm had passed, but the earth still smelled of rain and tension. Then, through the trees, a flash of chestnut fur, tangled mane, and terrified eyes. A foal, alone, limping, wild. It bolted at the first sound of her footstep, crashing deeper into the underbrush like thunder. But something in its eyes stuck to her ribs. The next day, she brought carrots. He didn't come. The day after that, she brought apples, sat in silence for hours. No one noticed she was gone. Her stepfather worked late, and her mother was always too tired to ask. Finally, on the third day, the foal emerged. Not close, just near enough. His ribs showed. His eyes were wide. His ears twitched at every crack of twig, but he didn't run. And that, for Nora, was louder than anything anyone had said to her in weeks. She named him Riot, not because he was loud, but because he was wild, unruly. A secret too big for a child to carry alone. She cleared a spot in the broken-down barn behind the hill, the one her grandfather once used, now forgotten and overgrown. She fixed the gate with old rope and nailed a sign to the beam, "Quiet inside." It was their wordless agreement. Every day after school, she visited Riot, brushed his tangled coat, cleaned the scrape on his leg, drew him over and over again in her notebooks. In every sketch, he grew stronger, and so did she. For the first time in months, she smiled. No one knew. Not the teachers who shrugged when she wouldn't talk. Not the mother who looked through her. Not the man who yelled and broke things and reeked of whiskey. It was just them. A girl and her horse, both a little broken, both learning how to stay. And when Riot rested his heavy head on her shoulder that first time, eyes closed, breathing slow, something inside her unlocked, not all at once, not into words, but enough to keep going. Riot didn't like loud noises. Neither did Nora. He flinched at the sound of thunder or the distant bang of a car door. Nora flinched at shouting. They both hated slammed gates, fast footsteps, sudden movements. It was as if their nervous systems were tuned to the same fragile frequency, broken radios picking up only static and warning signals. But together, they were quiet. She'd sit cross-legged in the straw with her back against a beam, and Riot would stand near, sometimes grazing, sometimes just watching her. She'd hum lullabies she barely remembered, soft and low, until he would finally lie down beside her, legs tucked, head resting on her sketchbook like a pillow. The wild foal had started to trust, and the girl who couldn't speak had started to feel safe. The barn became their world. She patched holes in the roof with plastic tarps she found behind the shed. She used her own school sweaters to keep Riot warm when the wind came through the slats. Once she even snuck oats from her stepfather's horse feed and carried them in a school backpack. Stealing again? he muttered when he noticed a bag was missing. But she just stared at the floor. No one suspected a thing, not even when she started sleeping better, not even when she stopped wetting the bed. Her mother chalked it up to maturity. Her teacher said she was adjusting, but it wasn't them, it was him. Riot learned her routines. He'd lift his head at the sound of her steps. He'd lean his weight against her shoulder when she sat beside him, like he knew she needed grounding. Once, she tripped in the paddock and twisted her ankle. Before she could crawl toward the barn, Riot walked over and stood so still beside her, she used his body to lift herself back up. No training, no commands, just instinct. She whispered, barely audible, "Good boy." It was the first word she'd spoken in weeks, and he heard it. His ear flicked, his tail swished, and he stayed. Time passed. She brought him a birthday cupcake with a carrot on top. He licked off the frosting and sneezed into her lap. She laughed, actually laughed, and for a moment, the barn felt like a real home. They survived their first winter with extra blankets and layered straw. Nora's drawings grew sharper, more detailed. Riot's coat filled in, his limp faded. They healed in tandem. She told him everything without words. How she hated the footsteps in the hallway. How her mom no longer looked her in the eye. How her heart thumped like a trapped bird every time the front door creaked open. And Riot listened. He always listened. One afternoon, a group of boys at school cornered her by the swings. "Why don't you ever talk, freak? She thinks she's better than us." One shoved her shoulder. Another snatched her sketchbook and flipped through the pages. "She draws horses?" They laughed. "Is she like, in love with a horse?" They tore a page. She didn't fight back. She didn't cry. But that night, she brought the ripped sketch to the barn and laid it in front of Riot. He sniffed it, snorted, then pressed his warm nose to her forehead. And that was enough. She didn't need anyone else to understand her. He did. In the months that followed, Nora taught him to follow hand signals. 1 finger meant stop, 2 meant walk, a wave meant stay. She taught him to bow his head on cue, not for show, but for closeness. She'd curl beneath him and rest her head against his ribs, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. At night, she imagined what it would be like if she could really talk again, if she could tell someone about Riot, about how he saved her, quietly, every single day. But she knew the truth. He was a secret she had to protect. Because if her stepfather ever found out, Riot would be taken away, just like everything else she'd ever loved. It started with a hoofprint, fresh, deep, pressed into the mud near the barn's entrance. But it wasn't Riot's. Nora crouched beside it. The print was broader, older, a workhorse. Someone had been here. Her heart kicked. She scanned the tree line, then darted inside. Riot wasn't in his usual place by the hay. He stood at the far end, ears twitching, tail swishing fast. His nostrils flared. He'd smelled something, or someone. She stepped close and touched his neck. His skin was damp, nervous. She whispered, "It's okay." But it wasn't. 2 nights later, she heard the voice outside the kitchen window. "Thought you said that old barn was falling in." A pause, then her stepfather's gravel-thick tone. "Figured I heard something back there last week. Might be a stray, or a thief." Nora stopped breathing. She pressed her back against the hallway wall, heart in her throat. They were talking about him. The next morning, she ran straight from school. The barn door was open. Her lungs burned as she sprinted down the path. When she reached the clearing, she skidded to a stop. The straw was trampled, the tarp roof half torn down. Riot was gone. A single rope lay limp over the stall gate, frayed at one end. She fell to her knees. At first, she thought maybe he'd escaped. Maybe he'd run back into the forest where she first found him. But when she followed the hoofprints through the trees, her hope shrank with every step. They didn't lead into the wild. They led to the main road. She didn't eat that night, didn't speak, didn't sleep. In the morning, she did the only thing she could think of. She took her best drawing, the one of Riot at rest, and walked 5 miles to the local feed store. The bell above the door startled her. The man behind the counter looked up. "Lost a horse?" he asked, eyeing the drawing. She nodded, showed him the picture. He studied it. "Can't say I've seen him. That white streak's real distinct, though. If he comes through here, I'll let you know." She walked home with blood in her socks and silence in her chest. Days passed, then weeks. No one at school noticed the way her fingers shook, or how her eyes always searched the fields beyond the windows. The barn grew quiet, cold. She still went every day, sat in the empty stall, folded her legs in the straw like she used to. She left apples. They rotted. She whispered goodnight. No one answered. One night she finally asked. Her stepfather was drunk, leaning back in his chair with a beer resting on his gut. She stood by the sink, clutching a dish towel. "Did you see a horse out back?" He didn't even look at her. Damn thing was tearing up the fence. Probably some wild Mustang. Animal control picked it up. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her chest cracked like old wood. He added with a smirk, "Thing was too wild to be useful anyway." She went to the barn that night and cried into the straw until she slept. She stopped drawing. She stopped visiting the barn. Something had been taken from her. Not just Riot, but the only place she felt safe. The only being who ever listened without judgment, who saw her pain and stayed anyway. The silence came back, but this time it wasn't protective. It was hollow. She didn't speak again for a long time, and when she did, her voice sounded different, like it belonged to someone older, someone who knew that even the wildest things could be caged, even the gentlest could be taken. The rain came fast that afternoon. Not a soft drizzle, but a sudden downpour that soaked clothes in seconds. Nora stood under the metal awning of the veterinary clinic, watching cars glide through the puddled street. She was 22 now, a vet tech, quiet, competent, reliable. She hadn't drawn in years, hadn't ridden. She still flinched at shouting, still didn't like enclosed barns, but she could bandage a paw in under a minute, could soothe a panicked dog with one hand and hold a syringe with the other. Animals still trusted her, and some days that was enough. The clinic bell chimed behind her. "Emergency call," said Rachel, the head vet. "Stallion down at the edge of town. Hurt leg. Could be fractured." Nora grabbed the kit. "You want me to assist?" "Yeah. They said the horse wouldn't let anyone near him. Sounds like a handful." Nora nodded. "Let's go." The rain hadn't let up. By the time they reached the field, the truck tires were sliding in the mud. The place was run down, a hobby farm with broken fencing and a tilted shed. A crowd stood near the paddock, holding umbrellas. "He's over there," said an older man. "Got spooked during loading, slammed into the trailer." Nora stepped out first and stopped cold. The horse stood across the field, rain lashing his coat, chestnut brown, broad-chested, head held high despite the limp, and there, stark against the dark mane, was a jagged white streak. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. It couldn't, but her feet were already moving. Rachel called after her. "Careful! He's aggressive!" But Nora didn't stop. She stepped into the paddock, slow and steady. No umbrella, no gloves, just her hand, outstretched, palm open to the rain. The horse froze. Ears flicked, muscles tense, then his nostrils flared. He tilted his head slightly, just enough for her to see the faint scar on his cheek, the same one he got when he ran into the barn gate as a foal. Her mouth trembled. Riot? His ears twitched. He took one uncertain step forward, then another. His head dropped, and with a heavy exhale, he pressed his forehead to her chest. No one spoke. Even Rachel stayed quiet. Nora wrapped her arms around his thick neck, blinking rain and tears from her eyes. She whispered, "You remember?" And though he didn't nod, didn't speak, she felt the answer in the way he leaned into her, in the stillness of the moment, in the way his breathing synced with hers. The field dissolved, the years unraveled. She was 10 again, wrapped in straw and silence, holding the only thing that ever held her back. He'd survived. They both had. After the examination, Rachel turned to her. "That horse trusts you. I've never seen anything like it." Nora nodded, wiping her face. "He's mine." Rachel blinked. "You owned him." Nora shook her head slowly. "No, he owned me." That night she stayed late at the clinic barn. Riot had been sedated for the x-rays and lay resting on thick straw. She sat beside him, back against the stall wall, knees pulled to her chest. The rain tapped softly now. She reached into her bag, pulled out a notebook. Blank. For the first time in over a decade, she drew. Not from memory, but from presence. The white streak, the scar, the eyes. Older now, wiser, just like her. It had been 2 weeks since Riot came back into her life. He'd recovered better than anyone expected. The fracture had been minor, more of a deep bruise. Nora had taken personal leave to stay with him at the clinic barn. She walked him by hand every morning, brushed him, spoke to him. She spoke now. Not much, not loudly, but enough. Each word tasted like light. She couldn't keep him there forever, but fate had plans of its own. When she returned home one evening, grocery bag in hand, she saw the truck, his truck, parked in front of her mother's old house, the one she hadn't stepped into in years. Her mother had passed 2 winters ago. The property remained in limbo. She hadn't had the heart to sell it. Now he was here, her stepfather, somehow, some why, still reeking of unfinished storms. She froze. The door creaked open before she even reached the porch. "Well, well," he said, voice slurred and familiar. "Look who finally crawled back." He stepped down toward her, beer bottle dangling from his hand. "You think I didn't know?" he sneered. "You and that damn horse. You always thought you were smarter than me." She tried to back away, keys clenched in her fist, but he moved faster than memory, grabbed her wrist. Her bag fell. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Not again. Not like this. And then, a sound like thunder. The earth shook. A deep, echoing whinny cut through the dusk. Nora turned. Riot. Charging across the pasture behind the house. She hadn't locked the gate. He'd been watching, waiting. Her stepfather turned too late. By the time he registered the blur of chestnut fury, Riot was already there. Not attacking, but blocking. He reared once, hooves flashing in warning, then landed. Still, massive, unmoving. Between them, nostrils flared, neck arched, body like a statue of judgment. Her stepfather stumbled back, hand still raised. What the hell is that?" Nora didn't answer. She didn't need to. Riot's presence said everything. "You're done here. You don't touch her again. She's not alone anymore." The man backed away, muttering curses, dropped the bottle, fled. Silence followed. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that settles after a long storm, the kind that lets you breathe again. Nora approached Riot slowly. He turned his head. Their eyes met, and she placed a hand over his scar like she used to. "I missed you," she whispered. He leaned in. No dramatics, just presence. That's all he ever gave, and all she ever needed. That night, she slept in the barn beside him, not because she had to, but because home had finally come back. Not the house, not the people, him. Spring came slowly that year. The trees behind the old house bloomed in uneven bursts, some shy, others bold. Nora had cleared out the shed, repaired the fence, and laid fresh straw in the old barn behind the hill. She wasn't just rebuilding a place, she was rebuilding a time. Riot grazed in the backyard now, freely, calmly. His movements were slower, more measured. His coat gleamed. The white streak down his mane had faded slightly with age, like a scar softened by years. He followed her from room to room like a shadow with hooves. When she sat on the porch with coffee and her sketchbook, he'd nudge her arm. When the mail truck pulled up, he'd stand at the edge of the gravel path, watching like a sentry. He never left her. Not again. One afternoon, she opened a letter. It was from the county. The land behind her house, the one where they first met, had gone up for community lease. Developers were circling. She knew what that meant. Pavement, noise, buildings. She folded the letter. Then stood, walked to the edge of the property, and looked out over the trees. Birds flitted across the canopy. Wind carried the scent of earth and sun-warmed bark. Riot stood beside her, silent as always. She reached for his mane. "Let's keep this wild," she whispered. The next month, she submitted a proposal. She offered to purchase and preserve the land as a small therapeutic center, a quiet place for children who didn't speak, or didn't feel safe, or didn't know how to feel at all. A place with animals, with pencils and paper, with silence that healed instead of hurt. A place with a barn. Approval came weeks later. She opened the letter beneath the oak tree. Riot stood beside her, breathing slow and steady. She laughed through tears, and he blinked slowly, like he understood. On opening day, she hung a wooden sign over the barn gate. It read, "Quiet inside," the same words she once nailed to the beam when she was 10. Children came in small groups. Some talked, some didn't. She didn't rush them. Instead, she showed them how to groom a horse, how to draw with charcoal on big sheets of paper, how to listen with more than their ears. And sometimes, when the sun was low and the wind was gentle, Riot would walk to the gate and press his forehead against theirs. No one ever forgot that feeling. She planted a tree beside the paddock, a small cherry blossom, delicate and soft, At its base, she buried the first drawing she ever made of Riot, folded, worn, but whole. Years later, a girl who'd once been silent too asked her, "Is Riot yours?" Nora smiled. "No," she said. "I was his." The cherry tree bloomed early that spring. Pale pink petals floated across the paddock, clinging to the fence posts, the worn boards of the barn, the sleeves of Nora's sweater. She sat cross-legged near the tree, a sketchbook resting on her knees, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Children played quietly nearby, brushing ponies, feeding rabbits, reading stories aloud to animals who listened without judgment. And Riot lay in the sun. He didn't rise much anymore. His breathing was slower. His coat had dulled around the edges, but his eyes still followed her, always her, as if even now he refused to look away. That morning, a boy named Daniel had drawn his first picture of a horse. It was crooked and a little shaky, a chestnut body with a long white streak down the mane. He'd handed it to Nora with a shy smile. "This is your friend," he said. "He looks like he knows secrets." She smiled and ran a hand over the page. "He does." By late afternoon, the children had gone home. The wind had died. Nora sat beside Riot, one hand resting on his shoulder. "I don't know how to say goodbye to you," she whispered. The old stallion didn't move, just blinked. A breeze stirred then, just enough to rustle the cherry petals, and one drifted down, landing on the tip of his nose. Nora reached out and brushed it away. That evening, the vet arrived. Nora stayed beside Riot through every breath. She whispered stories in his ear, about the barn, about apples and laughter, about sketchbooks and storms, about a little girl who once stopped speaking, and a wild foal who heard her anyway. He exhaled once, deeply, and then, stillness, not absence, but release. She stayed long after everyone had gone, wrapped in a blanket, pressed against the earth. The cherry tree swayed gently. Somewhere behind her, a horse whinnied, but it wasn't Riot, and it wasn't goodbye. Not really. The barn was quiet again, not empty, just quieter. The kind of quiet that comes after music, after laughter, after love. Nora walked the paddock fence with a mug of tea in her hand, watching the new foal stumble awkwardly on unsteady legs. It was early, the kind of morning when the dew still clung to every blade of grass, and the sky held a hush of blue that promised something sacred. The foal was chestnut, no white streak, no scar, but in the tilt of his head, in the way he watched her, there was something familiar, a softness, a spark. She didn't name him Riot. Riot was one of a kind, but she didn't need to name him yet. He'd let her know when it was time. Inside the barn, children arranged carrots in a row, giggling as a goat tried to steal them. One girl sat in a corner, sketching, pencil clutched tight, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Nora passed her, paused, and peeked over her shoulder. Another horse, drawn from memory. But this one had a little girl beside it, hand on its neck. No background, no title, just the two of them. Nora smiled. "You're getting really good." The girl looked up. "He visits me in my dreams sometimes." Nora nodded. "Me too." Later, she walked out to the cherry tree. The petals had begun to fall again, swirling softly in the breeze. She knelt at the base, placed a single apple on the soil, and beside it, she buried a small tin box. Inside, a sketchbook, her first one, pages yellowed, edges torn. At the center, Riot, drawn 100 ways, resting, running, listening, watching. As the wind shifted, she whispered, "We grew up together." Her voice didn't shake, not this time. She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and turned back toward the barn, where new hoofbeats were learning their rhythm, and new hearts were learning to trust. If this story touched something in you, if you ever loved an animal who loved you back without words, subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. And in the comments, tell us, what was the name of the animal that changed your life, even just a little? Your memory might help someone else remember theirs.